Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with sprint coach and head coach at Speedworks, Jonas Dodoo. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by simplyfaster.com, and that's spelled SIMPLI faster.com. So alongside the free lap timing systems, simplyfaster.com currently holds the eccentric K-Box. So if you haven't heard of the K-Box, it's a new product that uses flywheel technology to allow higher velocity eccentric overload. So I saw the K-Box for the first time when Mike Young from the US brought a couple over for one of his workshops in Gloucester. So off the back of that, I was really keen to use one, and I actually got my hands on one and was able to spend a couple of hours playing around with lots of different exercises and getting used to the K-Box. So from personal experience, getting out of the bottom of the squat, powering up and having the K-Box pull you through the floor on the way down is absolutely incredible. So basically, the harder you go on the concentric portion of the lift, the more it's going to give you on the eccentric. So if you're going to go for it, you're going to get pulled through the floor. At simplyfaster.com, there's also a great blog from Frederick, who is one of the co-owners of Eccentric, so you can learn more about the K-Box there. So if you are interested in getting a K-Box, get to simplyfaster.com, so that's SIMPLI faster.com, and get a K-Box for yourself. So this episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is also sponsored by Vald Performance, creators of the Nordboard. So if you haven't heard of the Nordboard already, don't worry, I'll explain. It's really simple. The Nordboard is a really fast and accurate system for monitoring hamstring strength. So as practitioners, we can do very little about athlete age and previous hamstring injury, but what we can do something about is our athlete's eccentric strength, and that's where the Nordboard fits in really nicely. It isn't going to get your athlete's hamstrings bulletproof, but what it is going to do is give you the right information so you can make the right decisions at the right time. So the Nordboard isn't available until December 2015, but if you do want any more information, you can go over to Vald Performance, that's VALD performance.com, or email info@valdperformance.com. Welcome to episode 55 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today we have Jonas Dodoo on the phone. So Jonas came on a couple of months ago and I sent him the MP3 over to have a little listen, and he assured me that he could do a better job. So we've just been trying to hook up for the last couple of months with World Championships, a new baby, things get in the way, so we haven't been able to do it sooner, but so glad we got Jonas on finally. It's a really great episode. So we go through action typing, where he talks extensively about his experience in grouping athletes together to get to know what they need. We talk about profiling of speed, so coach's eye versus actual sports science. And towards the end, we discuss all the work that Jonas is doing with his workshop and his consultancy. So I'm going to keep this intro nice and short because we've got another episode, technology segment, with Marco Altini. So I'll pass over to Marco. This is part 2 of his 3-part series on heart rate variability. So massive thanks to Marco, and you can catch all his stuff at hrv4training.com.
Hi Rob, thanks for having me again on your podcast today. In the last episode I've introduced HRV, so different ways to capture variations in consecutive heartbeats. And we've seen that HRV is often measured using a time domain feature called RMSSD as a measure of parasympathetic activity, and that we can use this feature to understand how physiologically rested we are and how much different stressors like training are affecting our body. This podcast is about interpreting HRV data, and I want to start first by spending a few seconds talking about what factors are consistently affecting HRV. And we have a long list starting from body posture when taking the measurement, respiration, typically with deeper breathing rates being associated to higher HRV, age with HRV reducing as we age, genetic factors, gender, time of the day, so basically the circadian rhythm, physical exercise, psychological stress, of course, chronic health conditions. So these are the main factors. And how can we get something useful out of HRV measurements if they are affected by so many factors? Well, we do so in two ways. First, we need to look at measurements with respect to ourselves, which means we need to collect a baseline or a series of recordings so that the effect of different stressors is always evaluated with respect to what are our normal values, without looking much at other people or the general population. Secondly, we also need to control for as many of the previous factors as we can, and then evaluate the effect of what we care about. For example, in the context of optimizing performance, apps like HRV for Training provide a set of simple rules so that the measurements you take at home is as close as possible to supervised laboratory recordings, and your data is more reliable. So here are a few rules that are very important to follow every time you measure your HRV. Try to take the measurement first thing after waking up while still in bed. This way you have consistent time of the day and you're not affected by other stressors. The only exception here is if you need to empty the bladder. In that case, do it, then go back, rest 1 or 2 minutes to make sure your body is not affected by physical activity, and then take the measurement. On measurement duration, well, short measurements have been validated multiple times, so you can trust 60-second recordings. Breathing, very important. It doesn't really matter what breathing frequency you pick, but try to be consistent. Use the same breathing pattern every time, which is typically shown by many apps so that you keep this component consistent. And finally, body position. So lying, sitting, or standing, all good. Again, what matters is that you do always the same, and if you decide to stand, it's important that you are patient and wait a minute or two before recording, since your body otherwise will be affected by physical activity. Once you follow these steps, if you perform regularly sports at good intensity, you'll see that your day-to-day changes in HRV, what we call acute HRV changes, will be mainly driven by the intensity of your trainings, since you control your measurements for many other factors, and you'll be able to better understand how your training program is affecting your physiology and recovery. So what you expect in this case is reductions in HRV on days following more intense trainings. So this is all for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we will be looking at HRV interpretations beyond what we discussed today, such as more exploratory analysis of long-term trends, which is an area of research which is still very active today. Thanks, Rob, again, and talk to you in about a week.
So massive thanks to Marco for providing us with some great information regarding heart rate variability. So the technology segment has got some really good feedback so far, so it's something I'll be continuing. So if you did want to push any feedback my way, that would be great. Anything you want to see more information on, and little bits of technology that you're interested in. So massive thanks to Train with Push today for sponsoring the technology segment. So as I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, still using the push band, still think it's such a great tool to use for your own training and your athletes. So there's been a few changes on the app itself, just a few little tweaks, and I know that the guys behind the scenes are working really hard to improve things even more. So with so much information around regarding velocity-based training, I'd definitely encourage you to get over to trainwithpush.com. They've got a really good blog. It's been going quite a while now, so there's contributions from Mlan Jovanovic, Brian Mann, various different people, as well as Matt Kuzdub, who's their sports scientist, who I had on the show quite a few months ago. So get over there. I'd really encourage you to get a push band, whether it's just for your own training or the athletes that you're working with. If you're in the UK, you can get to strengthandconditioningeducation.com/push, and you can get a push band for yourself there. So thanks again for tuning in to episode 55 of the podcast. Over to Jonas. I know you'll enjoy the episode, but again, would appreciate any feedback you've got, and I will speak to you soon. Okay, hi guys. Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today I've got Jonas Dodoo on the phone. So we had Jonas on a couple of months ago, but then we've been trying to redo it because we thought we could add a little bit more content into the podcast. So it's great to get him on. I know he's out of the house, escaping a baby crying, so we're not going to keep him in his car for too long. But thanks for making time for us, Jonas. Really looking forward to the chat. So do you just want to give us a bit of an introduction on yourself, your education, and what you're currently doing?
A bit about myself. Well, I'm a South Londoner, born and bred. My parents are from Ghana, and they came over a few years before I was born. I went to school in South London, and when I got to school, I got exposed to secondary school. I got exposed to rugby. I first turned up and thought, no, I'm not playing this posh boy sport. And within a couple of weeks, I realised actually I love the sport. I love running and jumping and hitting people, and actually it was a really good exposure to something very new. In school, I played loads of different sports: rugby, basketball, a bit of football, some athletics, and played for Roslyn Park and Surrey, and had England trials and stuff like that. But I was always injured, and I got to university. I went to Hartpury College and did my degree and my masters there. But literally within my first year there, I was so injured that I just stopped playing rugby. But continued training and lifting and sprinting with the team, and actually by my second year, realised that actually I could, get my thoughts across to some of the players about how they should perhaps train, and coached the women's team during my last year and my masters, and coached some of the Gloucester Academy boys in the off season, and actually found that I really liked coaching. So when I started my masters, which is in coaching science, I thought actually I want to know more about rugby, speed, power training, and maybe learn how to train people differently to how I had been coached. Because I personally believe that some of my injury history was based on just poor training programs or progressions, and lack of understanding of how to really rehab and look after my body. So during my masters, my masters was based on elite processes, expertise, and how we can go from novice to elite in a short period of time. And I was my primary focus was rugby and rugby coaching. So I looked through all the rugby literature and went back and kind of found myself in the early 80s, and anything before that, the rugby literature was quoting athletics coaches. And that was quite interesting. I was like, okay, well, where everything seemed to go back to Verkhoshansky and Matviev and Bondarchuk and all these guys, and so I started reading more about athletics coaches and found myself to the Canadian Athletics Coaching website that was run at the time by Derek Evely and Kevin Tyler, and that was a great resource because I was stuck on that website for months, just trying to read everything and anything on periodization, on acceleration, on power, on speed, and then I had questions, so I started emailing Derek again and again and again, and it got to the point that he probably just got really annoyed with me and said, "Look, mate, just call me." So then we had phone calls, and they had a lot of literature on Dan Path, so I was just trying to quiz them and find out more, and they said, "Okay, actually, why don't you talk to Dan?" So I started quizzing Dan again and again, and he said, "Okay, mate, you might as well just call me." so I called him and asked him more and more questions, and by the time I had got enough base understanding, I realized that actually, if I'm going to do this thesis any justice, I probably needed to be out there and spend some time with him. So at the same time, Derek had introduced me to Jim Dennison, who was the head of the PhD and the master's program in University of Edmonton, and he invited me over because there was an opportunity to do a PhD in speed and power and coaching philosophy. So I visited Edmonton. I visited Kevin and Derek out in Canada, one of the coldest places I've been, and then met with Jim, and then went to Dan and spent a couple months in San Diego with him there, and followed him around and watched everything he did, recorded everything he did, and wrote down everything he did. And basically the end product of my thesis was heuristics of expertise in athletics coaching. And I tried to reverse engineer everything that Dan done, and try to find his heuristics, his key tenets, his rules of thumb for all the decisions he made in coaching. And that was great. And I came home and wrote it up and finished my master's, and then kind of thought about if I was going to go to Edmonton to do this PhD, and I thought it would have been great. It would be great to finish and be Dr. Dodoo, and it would be a great title to have, and it would have just been me continuing the master's thesis I had started. But I had a bit of a moral dilemma, because I thought it would be really difficult to, 4 or 5 years later, to have a PhD in athletics coaching and elite coaching, and essentially tell people, I am a doctor in this event. I am an expert in how to coach elite athletes, if I hadn't actually done it myself. That was a massive moral dilemma I had. And so I decided that actually I wasn't going to go over there. I was going to stay home, and there was no opportunities to coach in a paid role, but I was just going to find a way to just stay and coach and practice everything I'd learned over the prior years. So I stayed home and coached kids and coached broken athletes and old athletes, and just started to just learn and apply things. But I was quite lucky. A year and a half later, Kevin was employed by UK Athletics to come over on the road to Rio. On the road to London Olympics. Then Derek was employed, and then Dan Paff was employed. So all the people that I had travelled across to the other side of the world, essentially, to go and learn from, were now all within a couple hours drive. And then within 6 months of Dan's employment, they advertised for apprentice roles based in London and Loughborough. I was lucky enough to get one of those roles under Dan Paff, so it was my dream come true. I had 3 years of learning under Dan, watching him, coaching my athletes alongside him, practicing, making mistakes, and got exposed to really good practice, and got to take athletes to World Juniors and to the Olympics, and got a Paralympic medal, and lived with Stu McMillan, and got to learn all about him and his philosophy, and then found myself in 2012, where my contract had run out and didn't really have another job to roll into, and started Speedworks. And essentially, Speedworks is a consultancy company that we work with team sports, rugby, football, pro, amateur. Alongside, I run a elite and emerging elite track and field group based out of North London. And we have a team of 10 staff of coaches and therapists and interns. And we currently have 30 track and field athletes based out of London, who all have aspirations to be the best they can be over the next 3 to 6 year journey. And that's kind of where we're at the moment.
So who's in the group that you're currently working with? The track and field group?
We had Greg Rutherford, who is currently the fifth British person to do the Grand Slam, win Olympic, Commonwealth, European, and Worlds recently in China, all within 3 years. So Greg is probably our flagship. Who Dan Paff coached him up to the Olympics. I almost took over from the past couple of years, and we still have Dan as a major influence, and Dan really did most of the work in the last 6 weeks build up to China. So Greg is our talisman. Chichindu Uja, the recent guy to go sub 10 last year and this year, and a major prospect for medals and finals over the next couple of years. And then a number of really good developing athletes who, 4 or 5 of them have run 10-1, 10-2, are all very young, and have major aspirations as well. Alongside that, boys and girls of from different nations, Paralympic, Olympic, and mostly sprinters and jumpers.
Hi mate, sorry I lost you there. No, that's all right mate, no worries. So I was actually speaking to Ian McKeown, who's at Port Adelaide this morning, and he was saying that he's going down to the World Athletics Centre. So obviously people are still tapping into Dan just like you did, them years ago. Uh-huh. So how important has Dan been in your development as a mentor?
Dan, I would say that 85% of my philosophy and my almost even how I design some of my microcycles and my training components have come from Dan. During my apprenticeship, I had the opportunity to be on the UK Sport ECAP program, which essentially fast-tracked the coaches working in different sports. And part of that gave me a budget to go and spend on anything I thought was important for my development. And this was maybe 2 or 3 years into my time under Dan, and it's quite clear that there's a large amount of successful coaches working in elite sport at the moment who have spent time with Dan over the past 30 years. Many of them are in the NCAA system, coaching in the best universities in the States. So I figured, actually, I think I know what I need to know, at least at the moment, about Dan Paff and his philosophy, but it would be really interesting to spend some time with other coaches who had also gone through that journey, but perhaps were 10, 15, 20 years ahead of me. If you look on the outside of a £2 coin, it says standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's a fundamental part of my philosophy. And I thought, okay, well, why don't I go and spend some time with these other coaches that had been through a similar journey to me, but had success far beyond me, and that had different perspectives. So I flew over with a colleague of mine and a mentor, Michael Afalaka, and we flew over to Florida, and we spent time with Lance Brownman and Mouse Holloway, who are successful coaches. Lance coached Tyson Gay and Campbell Brown, a number of other individuals, and Mouse Holloway is at University of Florida. And we basically drove from Florida to Louisiana. We spent time with Bruce Schickschneider and Dennis Shaver. We kept on driving. We spent time with Andreas Bayham and I'm forgetting names at the moment, and the guys at University of Texas, and basically spent time with 6 or 7 coaches who had learnt or worked with Dan Paff at a certain point in their life, and some were real big proponents of Dan, and some actually almost had philosophies that were counter to Dan's. And that's a great perspective to have. People that had learnt from him, had openly applied bits, or who openly said, actually, we don't really believe in that. And it's not just one thing talking to them, it's another thing actually looking at their programs, looking at their training components, how do they apply it throughout the year. And some still had the same circuits named the same as Dan uses in his components. So it's again great to see them using the same things that Dan was using, but maybe with a different flavor, maybe in a different order, maybe with a different justification. So Dan is the ultimate coach educator, who is also still getting high performance results. So yeah, without a doubt, he's had a major effect on my philosophy and a number of other philosophies. Something he said to me during 2012, he said, okay, he's been employed by UKA to come over and educate the coaches, but he didn't believe his effect would be at 2012. His true belief was that actually the 3 years he had spent educating and sharing would probably have a more lasting effect over the years after 2012. And actually right now, that's very clear. You have elite coaches, young coaches coming through like myself, Steve Frage. You've got Dan Cousins over in Bath. You've got a number of coaches coming through who actually 3 or 4 years ago were junior coaches, but were listening, learning from Dan and Kevin and Derek and others, and are now starting to establish their philosophy, and that's also coming out as elite results.
Cool. So I just want to move on to a couple of things we discussed beforehand, the nuts and bolts of the conversation, really, about action typing.
Mm-hmm.
So you just want to talk to us about what you mean by that and how the kind of different proponents of that you're looking at with your athletes to gauge what kind of athlete they are and what areas you're going to work on during their program.
Okay, I use the term action typing loosely. So there are 2 guys that come out of Europe who have a business called Action Types, and they apply physical testing to create psychological profiles based on Myers-Briggs, and the physiological testing or physical testing essentially starts to put people in categories of if they're front or back dominant, if they're high or low frequency. Now you need to talk to those guys to get the nuts and bolts of that, because even though I've been trying to use it and talk to them over the past 4 years, I still feel like I only understand 25% of it. But clearly, as coaches, anyone in any experienced coach can clearly look at their group of athletes they have now over their career and start to put them in some category, some kind of category. And that's all that I really wanted to be clear with when I talk to the action types. The psychological stuff is interesting, but I just don't understand it enough for me to talk to you now about it. Even if I'm applying it in my own coaching. But essentially, we all see pushers versus pullers. We all see quad dominant versus hamstring or posterior type dominant athletes. We all see concentric versus elastic type guys that like to spend time on the ground. That's how they produce their force. Guys who actually are very frequency based and like to move very, very quickly. We all see, guys that are, again, more stride length dominant or maybe stride frequency dominant. And this manifests itself as a result of people's nervous systems, their training history. It might manifest itself in terms of what, how much tendon they have compared to muscle mass in a certain muscle. So hamstring, how long is the tendon? Or you look at someone's calf with a really high calf with a really long tendon, they look more like a greyhound. Or you see look at someone with a really long calf and a short tendon, and they're probably a bit more endurance based, a bit more concentric in their action. So we're all seeing that, and the more I talk to coaches, they've all got their own terminology. You talk to Stu McMillan, and there's a term he uses, pushers versus pullers, and James Wild has been using that a lot in his research. And we're all seeing that, but not a lot of people are figuring out, okay, well, some of these guys, if they're pushers versus pullers, or if they're concentric more than elastic, some of these guys have are more likely to get specific injuries, are more likely to respond to certain types of stimuli, to certain length of cycle, are more likely to respond to certain cues more than others. Some of these guys look at the world in a different way to others. So it's important for us as coaches to start to compile this information on the different types and find a way to quantitatively assess this with, be it force profiling, be it movement analysis, be it speed profiling. So that's kind of where I'm going with that is, we've spent a lot of time looking at our athletes, their skill sets, how they apply force, where they're likely to break down in terms of injury. And we're trying to prescribe interventions, cues, exercises that are specific to their needs, and try to almost cut out the faff and cut out the stuff that doesn't really matter or has less influence on performance and health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times there, pushers versus pullers. So when you've defined that and you've got two different athletes in two different groups, how different are their programs? Is it very fine tweaks, or is it kind of radical changes?
I think it's fine tweaks. Mm-hmm. I think, and let me go back one step. I think we can all do both. Of course, we can all push and all pull. That's the point. Isn't what someone can do or can't do. It's actually what are they almost designed to do. What is the path of least resistance? And as a result, what are the likely injuries that are going to happen, and what are the likely cues that are going to work? I think you look at pushers, and these guys tend to be able to, regardless of the speed, be able to move a lot of force or produce a lot of force and move a lot of weight. Tend to want to reach out a bit more in front and spend a bit more time on the ground. So we know what their strengths are, and a big part of my philosophy is keep their strengths strong. So if I know that someone first to spend more time on the ground, perhaps has more muscle mass, or at least has a longer, has a bigger proportion of muscle versus tendon, I kind of know, okay, where should my S&C program go with that, and where should the priority in that program go. Again, I run a concurrent program, so we're doing everything throughout the year. There's a vertical integration of all of our components, but perhaps my concentrated load in the work that I'm doing is more towards that person's strength versus their weakness. And I think in your GPP, in your winter, in your off season, you work on someone's weaknesses, and as you get closer to when they need to perform at their best, you work on their strengths. So essentially, I think we maybe we're designing, or maybe I'm suggesting a model that flips around depending on someone's strength.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I've just written down here the assessment of those physical qualities. And so do you want to just talk to us about the kind of difference between actual physical assessments and actually eyeballing these guys, and how you kind of merge the two?
Okay, so I think, so if you want to talk more about force profiling and using sports science to identify people's strengths and weaknesses, I think you talk to someone who's actually using force plates and using force transducers and or linear transducers and actually is creating a lot of data with those kind of things. I talked to Brad Deweese yesterday, and they seem to have a real concise and practical approach to collecting data on a regular basis, and that's really because they've got force plates in all of their squat racks, and they're working with elite athletes across different sports. Michael Johnston's doing a similar thing over here in Great Britain, and there are a number of coaches doing that kind of thing. For myself, I'm real practical. I have too many athletes and don't actually have the budget to have all that stuff. So most of our profiling happens in with Coaching I, and happens where we can collect numbers. It's more to do with how people perform in standing long jump, standing triple jump, how people perform. What we do have is a jump mat, so how people perform in a variety of drop jumps from a variety of heights, with a focus more on short versus long contact times. And we like to see the difference when we give them a cue towards spending no time on the ground, and I'm really looking at reactive index, what kind of performance they produce. When I give them an open field and say, do what you need to do to get as high as you get, okay, what kind of performance do they perform? And then we start to weigh the difference between the two. But more specifically, it's actually looking at the numbers they produce on the way to 40, 50, 60 meter, depending on the athlete. Looking at the difference in the ratio between the 10, 20, 30 and 40, and see if, okay, are these guys that would rather produce, are these guys that their performances are more likely to produce faster 10s and 20s, and then they stabilize at a speed and just hold the speed? Or are these guys that keep getting faster? Are these guys, when we run through OptiJump, that have relatively longer stride lengths, and the increase or the rate of decrease of contact time again bottoms out early doors, and they just stay at a relatively slow contact time, but they just keep growing their stride length? Or are these guys that stride frequency and contact time continues to decrease and frequency continues to increase throughout the run? This tells us something about the individual and how they produce force.
So you mentioned there that the kind of standing triple jump, standing long jump. Mm-hmm. Do you use them as a kind of gauge to kind of acutely change your program?
Yes. Again, so I think we use them as a gauge to acutely change the program, but perhaps not in the early doors. I think perhaps in the early doors we're just using them as monitoring tools, as well as, the first 6 weeks of learning standing long jump, standing triple jump, bounds for distance, hops, are really, it's learning. So we can't really take those numbers and almost make a decision based on those numbers, because they're still learning, and there's that learning effect. But after that point, once they've had regular exposure to those movements, we start to see who is making bigger progress in those movements, what program are they having separate to that, versus who's struggling with those movements. And we have to use our common sense and say, okay, well, are they struggling because of the program they're doing alongside it? Is the weights and the other bits of the program complementary to this? And do we expect it to get better? Or actually, are the other bits of the program not complementary, and we're still in some kind of capacity phase, so we don't really expect it? So that's why in a program there's quite an undulation between extensification and intensification. And I allow, every 3 to 6 weeks, I'm going to allow the guys to drop a bit of it, of volume in the other components, and allow themselves to almost have some kind of overreach and see where they're at in those movements without being dampened by fatigue.
Cool. Just to take it back a step, you mentioned vertical integration.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just want to talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that?
And it's funny because terminology and semantics is hilarious. You talk to Americans and you talk to European guys and everyone talks quite differently. Vertical integration, concurrent training, conjugate training to me are all the same thing. In fact, if I was to describe my training, I reckon I've got some kind of vertical integration with undulation, with some kind of blocks system going throughout it, and I'm trying to have some kind of phase potentiation cycle to cycle or block to block. So I think, you know, we sit down and we read the old science or we read the old papers and we think that we can sit in one school of periodization, but I think essentially year on year, my guys, I'm having to find more ways to create variation so that I can actually have some kind of stimulation to their systems. So year on year, or the more advanced my guys get, the more I'm trying to play around with the different things. But back to vertical integration, my thoughts are that acceleration is a skill, and it's a skill we have to practice from the beginning. I think acceleration is king, and I think we have to always be practicing what our end result is. So if you're a rugby player, if you're football, if you're I don't know, a court sport, if you're athletics, I think we should be practicing and playing around with some kind of acceleration from the beginning. That means we're playing around with some kind of power, some kind of rate of force development from the beginning. But I think the old rules apply. I think we need to start in a place where developing capacity is key, and gradually move from capacity towards intensity and specificity. So that gradual move from capacity to intensity, or from extensification to intensification, or from GPP to SPP to comp, that gradual move is basically a gradual move from in your first phases where acceleration is in the program as well as capacity and maybe general means of training, moves from acceleration maybe being a tertiary goal, with capacity being your primary goal or your concentrated load, towards almost it all flipping round where acceleration and speed is become your concentrated load, and general specific capacity being perhaps secondary and tertiary to that. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, mate. Yeah. So just one thing I want to touch.
Vertical, sorry. That vertical integration phrase or terminology is a Charlie Francis terminology. And you look at concurrent and conjugate models that, you know, you can see throughout different periodization gurus and theorists. But essentially, we're talking about working all components at all times throughout the year, but some components taking a back step to others depending on your phase.
Okay. So you mentioned Derek at the start of the chat, and obviously he came on the podcast a couple of episodes ago. Yeah. And obviously he talked extensively about the Bondarchuk methodology. Uh-huh. Have you taken anything from that? Have you integrated that into some of your stuff?
Yeah, I think the Bondarchuk, what I take from Bondarchuk is a few things actually. That transfer of training is critical, and I think when you look at Bondarchuk's classification of exercises, I think that's the first place any developing coach should start, because you start to see what is really the event and what is really going to have transfer and what you should really be measuring for transfer, and then what is complementary to that. And then starting to figure out for your level of athlete, what proportion of each of your training cycles should perhaps prioritize on those other components. That's the first thing I take from it. Second thing I take from it is that variation is necessary to change stimuli. However, sometimes we get addicted to stimulate, adapt, but we forget to stabilize and actualize a skill set. And that's what I learned from Dan Paff as well. We get stuck in the stimulation, adapt, and we never really wait for the body to get used to it so that it can overperform at a certain component. So where I apply that really is in my competition phase and perhaps in my pre-comp phase, where most of my components become quite stable. Especially my special developmental components and my special prep type components, my plyometrics, my explosive strength in the gym, and definitely my max strength become quite stable. The volumes and sets, the exercise suggestions, selection becomes quite stable. And what I start to and what I start to play around with and what I start to care more about is performances in races and performances in speed and speed endurance sessions in training. So my competition phase is, my programs sometimes go from 6 all the way to 12 weeks long. And people say, okay, well, don't they get stagnant? And then how I prevent stagnation is making sure I stay on top of how I prevent regression in energy systems is making sure I have a maintenance load of everything at some point with different kind of densities, and how I prevent stagnation is almost in the same way. I make sure that there's a variation of my competition event and make sure that I play around with densities of activation of those systems and also resting of those systems.
Mm. So that brings us on to the next point quite nicely, about transfer of training that we spoke about previously, and creating that transfer between the strength that's been built to actually speed on the track or speed on the field or speed on the court, whatever it may be. I know we did speak about that with Derek quite extensively, obviously with the Bonderchuk link. So just want to give your take on how we're making that transition and getting that transfer.
Well, it's a bit of a loaded question sometimes because, I think if you need to run fast, as long as you're running fast, it's going to transfer. If you need to change direction, as long as you're changing direction, it needs to transfer. I think what needs to happen is an understanding of almost primary, secondary, and tertiary type transfer exercises. And I think for a developing athlete who is weak as piss and not fit, just getting them fit and getting them a bit stronger makes them better at their event. And the closer you get to filling up those capacities, the less they transfer. And then you start to, and maybe that's just your tertiary transfer. Maybe just getting them fit is all you need to do to get them to be better at their event. Now, once they're fit and they're generally strong, it's okay, well, it's not just maximum strength or capacity we need. It needs to be a bit more specific. It needs to be a bit more explosive. So getting them to be explosive in general movements, in squat jump, cleans, standing long jump, box jumps, repeated hurdle jumps, okay, then we're going to have a bit more of a transfer to the event, because it's not just about producing force anymore. It's can they produce force within a specific time period. And then once you've got that, the question is, okay, well, do they know how to produce force in a specific time period in the right direction? Can they produce, and that's essentially athletics. That's essentially linear sports. And then where you go in team sports is, okay, can they produce force in the right time frame, in the right direction, at the right time? Can they make the right decision? Can they produce the force? Can they make this decision in a varied environment with a variety of decisions at disposal? That for me is where team sports have that last piece of transfer, and I sincerely believe it's in that order. And again, I'm doing everything concurrently. It's not that I wait for someone to be able to squat 2 times their body weight before I start plyometrics, and it's not that I wait for them to stand in long jump 3 meters 30 and do 3 bunnies over 11 meters before I decide that I'm going to start some speed. And it's not that they have to run a sub 4 second 30 meters or anything like that before I decide that they can do change of direction. It's everything has happened at the same time, but year on year, as people move towards being elites, the proportion of how much time is spent is what changes.
So in team sport, obviously in athletics, if you're measuring the success of your program, if the guy runs quick, that's quite an easy way to measure it.
Yeah.
How is that? Obviously differs because there's so much more involved, so many more variables involved in a rugby setting. So how are you measuring your impact as a coach in a team setting compared to track and field? Hi, Jonas. Sorry, it cut off there as soon as you started that question. So obviously in athletics and track and field, it's reasonably easy to measure the impact of your program.
Yeah. So the measurement in track is linear. And so how do we measure in team sports? I think, especially for developing athletes, it is still linear. And I think the measurement of your S&C program is essentially going to be on your speed profile. JB's research, and I spoke to him a few weeks ago, he is stating clearly that for elite and for developed athletes, there isn't a direct correlation between the jump force profiling and speed profiling. So I think the ultimate measure of your strength program, especially in speed power sports, is going to be how fast they run. Now, I think a measurement of coaching towards your event. So if you're measuring the athlete's ability to play football, okay, yes, you can put in some change of direction type stuff, but essentially it goes back to what I was talking about before, where it's more about them making the right decision rather than just ability to do a T drill, for example. So when I go into when I'm a consultant, it depends what hat I'm wearing and what my remit is from the guys that are bringing me in. With Theo Walcott, the goal was he was coming from rehab and he was going back into on-feet type training. So the goal was to get him back to speed, to develop lower leg conditioning and stiffness and return his the rehab leg back to the same kind of level that it was prior. So he came back faster than he was prior. I then think it depends on what hat I wear. If I'm kept in, or if the desire is for me to then do more specific stuff to do with the event, then you have to bring in change of direction, acceleration, speed in an environment where the athlete is being forced to recognize cues from his opponent or even from his teammates and execute the right task then. But it all depends on what hat you wear. If you're on a football team or if you're in a team sport where you as S&C coach, pure goal is to get your guys strong, fit and explosive and have the ability to change direction, then I think your measurement of success of your program is going to be the numbers you get from your timing gates, the numbers you get from your jumping, and from any other kind of where you monitor strength and power and change of direction, and single leg stiffness and all those other bits and pieces. But the closer you get into the coaching team, then it becomes the ability for the athlete to execute the task when it really matters, and execute the right task. And that's where you get into actually probably not even using numbers as much and more making sure they're executing the right task at speed. And I know some people may have may use cameras and count and measure contact time and the time it takes for an athlete to stop, do a decelerate. Seem to be creating their own methods of measuring this, but that's not where my skill set lies. My skill set lies in getting people faster, stronger, giving them the ability to be more elastic, giving them the ability to decelerate better, to accelerate better, to orientate their body and rotate and change direction, 45 degrees or 180 degrees, or to a sudden stop. However, that's when it stops. That's where my job stops, and then the coach's job takes over.
Mm-hmm. So you spoke a little bit about monitoring change of direction and the obviously importance of reacting to a cue that's specific to the sport.
Yes.
How are you combining them two into something that can actually be measured?
That's my point. Is that at the moment I'm not.
Okay. All right.
At the moment, I know Dan Howes is really hot on this at the moment. So what we're really trying to do is make sure that the teaching of it happens. But I think I feel that that's a difficult thing to measure, and I'm yet to know of how people are doing it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So again, you mentioned there about some of the consulting that you're doing with various different teams. And you've obviously got and just to come back to something we spoke about at the start, your workshop that you've got coming up. So you've got the workshop coming up in start of November. You just want to talk to us a little bit about that and a little bit about the consulting that you're doing at the minute.
Okay, so I run Speedworks, and that's my primary focus on my athletes there. But I do some consultancy work with the RFU, with the England Sevens men and women's program, and work with Luke and Kate with the women's, and Dan Howes with the men's. And those guys are really switched on. Sometimes I feel like I'm just there to teach them to suck eggs because they know what they're doing. But it's great to combine my recognition of linear speed and power and progressions and cues, and bond with the team, and talk to the coaches, not just the S&C coaches, but the lead coaches, about what they want for their players at this specific time. And so at our workshop, we've got, and then further to that, I work at Bath Rugby, and I've been there for the past 3 years. And again, it's the same scenario. It's just I've obviously had more time over the past 3 years to really to really teach the underpinnings of my philosophy, and the coaches there have taken bits on, and I'm only up there once every 2 weeks, but they carry on with bits and pieces, and I get a bit more specific goals because I work with a rehab team and all of those kind of bits and pieces. So our workshop is focused and kind of built around team sports conditioners, and it's a combination of myself and Ben Rosenblatt, who perhaps is the guy you need to talk to about measuring change of direction.
Yeah, definitely.
And how he monitors that, because I think that's definitely his skill set. And he's gone over a really interesting journey over the past 4 years with those girls, because essentially he started by just wanting to get them faster. And realized that they kept on breaking down. So he had to realize, okay, I've got to get these general components really, really on point so that they don't break down from the speed. And then they got faster, but their speed wasn't necessarily transferring into the event. They were running faster through the gates, but they weren't actually running necessarily faster during the game. Then he realized, okay, he had to start to manipulate some of his speed sessions and his progressions into his speed or out of his speed into bits that forced them to start to make decisions. And that's where the interesting work is done, and that's where my interest lies. Essentially you can make someone faster, but it's then making sure they understand and recognize and create habits and reflexes to apply that speed and those new movement patterns and those new timings into their environment. And that's kind of why I haven't really focused on how I'm measuring just the change of direction speed in the event, because essentially as long as they're making good decisions very quickly, then I know that, and in using the technical model that we've learned prior to that phase, then essentially my job is done. And that looks and sounds different in hockey, in rugby sevens, in rugby 15s, in football. So the workshop is all about sharing some of those ideas, sharing some of the science that underpins it, sharing some of the research that is perhaps more based on coaching philosophies and applied coaching programs, as opposed to just the theory and science. And then the workshop is very, very practically based, where we'll talk about some prepared to train and apply some of the bits, because I think as coaches, we learn best through doing. And I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to sit down and talk theory with you. So that's the workshop. That's on November the 7th. That's going to be really fun. I'm really looking forward to it. It's the first one we're doing, and we have a few more planned that are a bit more towards therapy and health, but with a practical element again, and with performance at mind. And then second to that, we, myself and Paul Bryce, have been working with different team sports and giving them an opportunity to wear. So we go into team sports with our first hat, and our first hat is basically, here's a profile of jumps, here's a profile of speed, here's where we think what kind of type your athlete is, and here's a kind of thing we would do with this individual. People tend to bring 2 or 3 of their case studies along, and typically is the guys that aren't making the progress that they expect to make, or it's the guys that keep breaking down. And we like to give some understanding of why this person seems to be having multiple hamstring injuries, why this person isn't transferring all this big strength that you've developed away from here into sprinting, what are the key technical things we're seeing in the video, what are the key things the numbers are saying from our analysis, and then we give the teams, the S&C coaches, the data and say, okay, go away and work with it. We'll come back in 6 weeks, or we'll come back in 12 weeks. So that's something we're also offering, and that's what I wanted to share with you guys as well. So we've now got to a point where we've kind of got our processes down to a T, and we're really open to people approaching and asking for some help.
Cool. So where can people get in touch with you for both the workshop and the bespoke programming stuff?
So both ways is through email, info@wearespeedworks.com. My Twitter, eatsleeptrain_. My website is wearespeedworks.com. And, send us an email, send me a tweet. These days people tweet direct message me just as much as they email me. My wife is the person who will probably pick up the email, and she'll be really concise and get back to you really soon. And I'm usually the person on Twitter.
So does your wife do your kind of admin and stuff like that?
Yeah, so my wife...
She's a full-time employee?
She wishes, no. So she's a full-time mum and a part-time employee with me 1 day a week, and she works for England Athletics in their coach education. She's a lead mentor for jumps and combined events. So yeah, she was an Olympic athlete. She went to Beijing in the heptathlon, and then she was also apprentice coach on the Dan Path. So we spent 3 years with each other up until 2012, and then she manipulated me into getting married and having a baby. Don't tell her I said that.
No. Okay, cool. No, that's great. So I'll put all the links that you've mentioned on the website. So what you mentioned right at the start, I've got it down in capitals. The book with James Wild. I can't forget to mention that. Tell them about
exactly.
that.
I would get in trouble for not mentioning that.
Yeah.
So James Wild, James is great to speak to because he's doing his PhD in acceleration, and actually John Goodwin is also doing his PhD in max velocity sprinting, and I love to spend time and talk to guys that are deeper in the science than I am. And some of it is just because maybe sometimes every 3 to 6 weeks I think I'm a fraud, and I just need to talk to these guys and just make sure I'm on the right path. So James and I have been working with Olivia Breen, my Paralympic athlete, for the past 2 or 3 years, because she accesses him at Surrey Sports Park. But also we've been working on ideas about acceleration, about transfer, about profiling of different athletes. So James put out a really good book out maybe last year, I think it was, and basically the book that we're trying to do is maybe a continuation of his theory-based book with a few more practical elements to coaching. So essentially, I couldn't bring out a book by myself because, one, I'm dyslexic. Two, it would take me about 15 years to write and just come to a decision about what I want to put down. So James and I are going to put something together that's just a bit more practically applied compared to his previous book.
So how far along is that, Jonas?
Beginning stages.
Okay.
But it needs to be done soon. So we're under the crotch at the moment. Yeah.
Cool. And can you remember the title of James's book? I know the front cover, I just can't remember the title.
His first book, no. That's very bad of me.
I'll get a link and I'll stick it online as well.
What I would like to say is I read his book and it was quite interesting. I feel like I spent maybe 5 years trying to read everything, and then within that time also trying to talk to all the best coaches that I could find. If I was at a competition and I met John Smith or I met Bobby Kersey, I would buy him a coffee and sit him down and quiz them until they're annoyed. And I feel like I spent the beginning parts of my career trying to find common denominators and nuances of different programs and apply it into my philosophy, into my training table. And I was really proud at the end of it. And then James wrote a book and it basically summarizes it all. And so, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, it was really difficult to find a lot of the information. But I think with the internet and with science almost justifying and solidifying a lot of good coaching practice, it's quite easily available. And what James has done is he's compiled that really well into easy format to read and understand. So if you haven't read that book, it's really good to go and read. And you talk to some people, say it's just the basics, but actually it's the people that do the basics very well and understand the basics really well that actually get the results.
100%. Cool. Like I say, I'll remember the title and put the link online so people can grab it.
No problem. So a note to your listeners: sometimes I talk really fast, and I recognise that maybe some of this interview may have not come through the way people listen or hear. They might struggle to hear what I'm saying. So feel free to send me an email, send me a message, and I'm happy to kind of elaborate on points.
Cool. I've actually thought about doing transcriptions, but no, it's too much money. It's too much money. So I don't fancy.
You may struggle to transcribe everything I've said today. Yeah.
I don't fancy typing it out myself. So
me neither. Yeah.
So yeah, cool. Well, thanks for your time, mate. Appreciate you coming on again and delivering some great info.
No worries, buddy. So I'm happy to help.
Cool. Well, I'll let you go, and thanks again for your time.
Awesome.
All right, pal. Speak to you soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
See you, mate. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to episode 55 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So firstly, a massive thanks to Val Performance, Simply Faster and Train with Push for sponsoring the episode today. Secondly, I want to say you need to get yourself down to Lee Valley on the 7th of November to listen to and get involved with Jonas's workshop. It'll be a great event and I'm definitely going to be there, so give me a heads up and say hello. If you do want to check out all previous episodes of the podcast, you can get over to paceyperformance.co.uk/podcast. And as I mentioned in the episode with Jonas, all links to what he mentioned in the episode, including how to book on his workshop, are available at paceyperformance.co.uk/55. So thanks for tuning in, and I will speak to you soon.